Farlost, Fog of War. Three. Hara had the airlock to herself all the way up to the dock. She balled her hands on her hips and paced nervously back and forth. Pirates? Docking at Olin? She knew they were getting bolder the last few years, pushing deeper into populated areas of the belt. Even so, they struck from dark places between the bigger rocks. She'd never heard of a pirate bold enough to come to port, broadcasting a ship ID flagged with the skull and crossbones. Jake and her kids were out there, right now. Otana Mechanica wasn't as prosperous as Dutton Haulage, but the reputation for ship repair and refit was as good as they came. Jake could bid against refit groups twice their size because he worked hard and he was smart. He flew smart, too. Her man ran a tight ship, a silent ship, and they could afford looping trajectories to avoid pinch points where pirates might strike instead of making straight runs to save fuel. The Reaches, the sector of the Winter Belt where Olin orbited, was a populous sector of the belt. The new suburbs, not the naked wilderness. Don't overreact. It's been 16 years since you've even seen a pirate ship. And back then, a cruel whisper of memory reminded her, you were its cargo. Hara buried that whisper. The memories from those days were still too much. So unlike the person she had become, almost painful. She'd been a different person, in more ways than one. The doors slid open and Dinesh was waiting there for her. Behind him, Olin's expansive docking facilities were empty of its usual crowds. Evacuation symbols blinked on every terminal. Are they still waiting? She wanted Dinesh to tell her the mystery ship had changed their mind and flew away. They're out on the pin. Her stomach twisted. Docked? I told you to keep them orbiting. They performed a manual dock without clearance, he shouted back. What could I do? I've never shot down a ship, Mayor. She leaped onto the high-speed auto walk and ran flat out towards the far end of the dock, half a kilometer out. Chief Train's out there now, Dinesh called after her. Hara stumbled off the auto-walk at the head of the pin and just caught herself before she bowled into Eric Train. The police chief wore his usual off-duty bomber jacket. It was cold on the dock, but it looked out of place with a duty pistol in his hand. Train scowled. Not the place for you. Don't you dare Mrs. Mayor me, Eric. She walked around him and nodded at the two dock cops, their guns also drawn, standing either side of the airlock gantry. It was the sole airlock on that wall, the very tip of Olin's dock. It had been optimistically designed for larger ships, higher volumes of trade the local businesses worked for, and the tourist trade everyone hoped for. Eric caught up with her. You want to parley? Fine, but stay off to the side until I can suss out what's coming. Something ugly pounded inside of her chest at the idea of someone else leading the charge. She figured her face carried that message to Eric. He was an old friend who knew her well. Both hands on his pistol pointed away from Hara and down at the deck. He leaned closer. Please, Hara, just stand back. You can handle everything else. Just let me handle entry. Hara didn't trust herself to speak. She gave him a jerky nod and backed up on the hinge side of the airlock where she'd be shielded by the mass of the enormous door when it opened. Eric stood between his men. All three trained their weapons on the sealed airlock door. A familiar tone and green light emanated from the airlock assembly. Ready, Eric ordered and racked the slide on his pistol. The men to either side of him did the same. Once upon a time, Hara could have identified the guns, but she'd shoveled a lot of rock over those memories, too. Hara opened a utility locker and grabbed a metal pry bar from its hook. She raised it over her shoulders as the airlock hissed, the pressure inside equalizing with Olin. She stayed behind the frame as motors slowly dragged it open. Eric and Jake were mahjong buddies. There was a groove on the living room sofa just for him. The last thing she saw on his face before the airlock hid him from view was a last concerned glare before he turned forward and drew a bead on the center of the doorway. Nobody fires unless I do, she heard Eric tell his men, who grunted similar takes on, "Yes, Chief." The one she could still see had a trembling grip on his pistol. This kind of stuff didn't happen on Olin, Hara thought, as she heard boots echo in the airlock. Moments later, a buzz-cut, muscle-bound human in a ship suit stepped past the big door hiding her. The man had his hands up. Another human and a Skanen, their hands and pincers, empty and raised, followed. The police correctly spread out to flank the three. Chief Train came back into view, partially blocked by the lead human. The first man out was young and moved like a soldier. The Skanen was also in a ship suit. The armor chitin on its thorax was clean, but he had what looked like pirate tattoos below the wriggling eye stalks on the side of his head. The second human was a little older and wore a business suit, of all things. "Olin Police," Train barked. "Identify yourself." "We surrender, officer," that second human drawled, stepping up past the other. "Take us to your leader." Hara froze. She knew that voice. Train lowered his pistol to his waist. His men did the same. Eyebrows furrowed, the police chief looked over at Hara. The younger man took another protective step, blocking the man whose voice she recognized from the line of fire. "I'm Sergeant Blocker. We're here to speak with Hara Otana." "You found her," Hara heard herself call out, low and gravelly. She stepped forward, the pole still gripped tight and ready to swing. Captain Blocker and the man in the suit turned. Hara couldn't believe her eyes. His once thick black hair was steel gray now, his black eyes inset a little deeper, his chiseled chin pudgier. The smarmy bastard dropped his hands and smiled. "There you are, Captain." Nguyen. Train's eyes darted between the mayor and the pirate. "Captain," he mouthed silently. She ignored him. "What are you doing here?" For a moment, the bastard looked genuinely apologetic. "It's that time again." Hara dropped the pole to the ground. Train and his men all jumped as the loud metal ring echoed up and down the empty dock. Part of her wanted to run. Another part wanted to shut the men up before they could tell her people another word. The part that had kept her marriage together, kept Olin prospering, won her the job as mayor, that part won out. The part of her that always did what needed to be done. "Chief, I'm declaring a code red emergency. Shut down all incoming and outgoing comms and lock down this dock."